As the morning light was just beginning to enter the dense fog of the cloud forest, Brian G505 and Alpha 2 were approaching the coordinates where they last saw Gargantum. They hadn't encountered any form of resistance, covenant or otherwise, up to that point, which they found odd. As they approached the coordinates, they saw somewhat carved dirt path on the ground leading from the docking yard into the forest. They didn't want to use the path directly, as they would surely be spotted, so they opted to follow where it led from about 16 yards into the forest. They followed the path for about 10 minutes and saw the path begin to disappear more and more. Another several minutes of walking, and the path disappeared completely. McClain noticed that some of the plants by the path seemed stomped on, as if something moved off into the forest. Brian knew it wasn't wise to move into the dense forest, but they didn't have much of an option. They didn't have any other leads on Gargantum's secret location. Brian ordered the ODSTs to cross the path and move to where the tracks were. He put McClain up front for tracking. Vanna and Riley were right behind him. Brian was fourth, and Brenner chose to keep the rear covered. The forest started off dense, with McClain having to use his knife to cut through vines and bushes. The trees and vines obscured so much that team could only see a yard in any direction. However, the fog began to clear up, and the team, trekking for about 6 more minutes, began to see the forest open up more. The trees became so tall you couldn't see the tops of them. They even seemed to interconnect like a web. All manner of bushes and shrubbery filled the forest floor, and the team could see at least 7 yards in any direction now. They continued through the forest for then a few minutes before McClain spoke up.
I'm starting to lose the tracks. They're disappearing.
Keep an eye out, Alpha 2.
They're gone. They just stopped.
I'm no hunter, but I don't think tracks just suddenly stop, said Riley. Hey guys, look over here, Lance Corporal Vanna said. The team continued forward past where the tracks had stopped to look at what Vanna had found. It was some form of Covenant equipment, but not old. It was active. McClain got one good look and hit it with the butt of his battle rifle.
We're being watched.
You sure? How do you know?
Because that was a motion sensor. We may have already passed through multiple.
Are we walking into a trap? Riley asked.
We're already in the trap.
Right as McClain was ending his sentence, the team heard multiple shuffles in the trees above them. And then a chanting started. They began to look in all directions, but none of them could spot any enemies. It was as if the forest had just come to life and was engulfing them. Then just as quickly as the chanting started, it stopped, disappearing, leaving the forest dead silent. Brian immediately ordered everyone back the way they came, but it was too late. Lance Corporal Cain Riley was the first to go. He was hit with the blade end of a gravity hammer, which hooked to his armor. When the team looked at what had swung, it was the chieftain himself, Gargantum, standing almost 9 feet tall, adorned in golden armor, and bringing with him a sadistic aura. Gargantum still had Riley hooked to the blade of his gravity hammer and laughed. As he slowly peeled Riley from the blade. Riley, grasping for air, looked towards the team and reached out his arm. Brian started firing shots at the chieftain, but Gargantum immediately threw Riley at Brian. Brian stopped firing and caught Riley quickly, putting him on the ground, which is when Gargantum swung Brian with his hammer. Brian caught the hammer by the haft, but Gargantum used the hammer to bring Brian towards him and took Brian by the throat, choking him and damaging his armor's shielding systems. Brian unsheathed his knife, stabbing Gargantum in the arm multiple times, prompting the chief to throw Brian about 20 feet. But Gargantum took the knife from his arm and broke it in half, throwing it on the ground behind him. Brenner, McClain, and Vanna all took defensive position behind trees and began taking shots at Gargantum. He took Vanna next. The chieftain bull rushed the tree she was behind, snapping the tree in half like a twig. She moved to avoid him, but he grabbed her leg so fast, and with so much force, he not only crushed her lower leg, but popped it out of the socket and tore her leg off of her body. Gargantum threw the leg on the ground and began walking towards her, with the most sadistic grin on his face.
Fucking hell! Brenner, get Riley and Brian now.
McClain began dumping battle rifle shots into Gargantum's back. Gargantum didn't care, though, picking up Vanna and ripping her head off with his mouth. He spat out her head and proceeded to tear her body in half, turning towards McClain and laughing once again. When Brian finally recovered, he looked upon Vanna being torn in half. Still slightly dazed, he saw Brenner hanging over Riley's now lifeless body. Brian began to make his way to Brenner. Got a glimpse of Riley's body. A hole was left where his chest originally was. The blade had crushed his sternum and ribs, split his lungs, and stopped right before his spine.
Brenner, take the pain and get the hell out of here! Brenner! I can't leave him behind.
Brenner, you have to go. I'll off as long as I can. Take that, you overgrown.
McClain fought damn hard, getting a few good shots in, but was ultimately the third to go. McClain had tried to stay out of Gargantum's reach. The chieftain was just too big and too fast for a normal human to keep up with. Gargantum grabbed McClain by the torso and threw him on the ground so hard he bounced back up several feet, and Gargantum kicked him about 19 feet forward. McClain tried getting up, but he was coughing up blood. Gargantum tossed McClain around like a rag doll, before Gargantum finally lifted him up by his head and threw him down into a sharp rock, impaling McClain through the chest. He didn't even get the mercy of dying on impact. McClain would bleed out over several minutes in excruciating agony, dying from both shock and blood loss. Brian was still trying to get Brenner to leave when he saw Gargantum running towards them, and within seconds it was too late. Gargantum wound up his swing with the blade side of his gravity hammer face down. As the hammer was coming down, Gargantum used the gravitic impalers in the head of the hammer to boost his swing down towards Brenner. But Brian, just in time, pushed Brenner away with his left arm. Brian's left arm was severed in the blink of an eye, and both Brenner and Brian went flying in opposite directions. Brian's body went into full-on survival mode and punched so much adrenaline into it, he didn't even notice his arm was gone. His armor attempted to deploy bioform to his injuries, but was only partially successful due to the heavy damage sustained. Most of the foam was leaking out at the wound site. All Brian could think about was saving Brenner. He saw Gargantum moving towards where Brenner had landed. Brenner, shaken up, was trying to move away from Gargantum. While on the ground, Brian pulled the magnum from his right thigh, unloading multiple shots in the back of Gargantum's helmet. The chieftain, finally tired of Brian, turned towards him, and Brian began firing the rest of his magazine into Gargantum. This gave Brenner the opportunity to find his silenced SMG on the ground and unload multiple shots into the exposed part of the chieftain's leg. Gargantum swung his arm behind him, hitting Brenner so hard that Brenner's feet lifted off the ground and Brenner went flying into a tree. As soon as Brenner hit the tree, he wasn't moving anymore. Brian attempted to fire more shots, but all he heard was click, click, click. The magazine was empty. Seeing that his friends, his last hope at a family, may have just died in front of him, Brian went into a blind rage. Brian got off the ground at a breakneck speed, rushing Gargantum. Brian noticed the broken knife on the ground and picked it up mid-sprint. Gargantum shook off the wound in his leg. He turned towards Brian, but was immediately greeted by Brian sliding under him and cutting his right Achilles tendon. Gargantum's right knee hit the ground, and the next thing he knew, his right side vision disappeared. Brian took the broken knife and sunk it into Gargantum's right eye. Gargantum screamed out in pain, falling to both knees for a moment, pulling the broken knife from his eye and filling with immense rage. Brian moved near Brenner and quickly checked to see if he was conscious. Brenner's pulse was faint, but he definitely wasn't moving. Brian picked up Brenner, throwing him over his right shoulder, and sprinted back the way they came. As Brian was running, his vision began to go in and out. It took everything he had to stay awake. The adrenaline wearing off, the pain became immense, and he was struggling to keep his footing. Brian's footing nearly gave out right as he reached the path that led to the docking yard. That's when he looked back and realized he'd been leaving a trail of blood and foam. It wouldn't be long before Gargantum caught up to him, if he didn't hide and stop the bleeding. Brian knew it would be at least another 30 minutes of running to get back to the cave, but he wouldn't have the energy or the blood left to get that far. Brian moved across the path, further into the forest, eventually blacking out for a second. That 1 second was enough for Brian to lose his footing, causing him to fall down a hill that led to a small river. Brian tried to hold on to Brenner, but with only one arm, he eventually slipped from Brian's grip, and they both slid to the bottom of the hill. As Brian lay soaking wet in this small river, he began to crawl towards Brenner. Once he was right next to Brenner, he tried his best to make a call to the rite of passage, hoping by the grace of God he would be heard. Brian heard someone's voice, but couldn't make out what they said. He saw coordinates pop up on his HUD that led down the river. So he picked up Brenner and moved with what little energy he had left to make it to those coordinates. As Brian went in and out of consciousness, he only remembers coming to a clearing where a pelican was waiting. Then Marines firing at something behind him. Then he was on the floor of the pelican, right next to Brenner. Brian woke up 4 days later on an Oni medical station, laying in a bed looking up at the ceiling. At first, he thought he had just woken up from a terrible nightmare. Then the memories started rushing in one by one, getting worse and worse as they went along. Brian sprung up from his bed, sweating, heart pounding, his heart monitor beating faster and faster as more memories came in. The nurse quickly came in to try and calm him down. He asked her what happened. He went to reach out with his left arm to grab the railing of the bed. His body fell forward, and the nurse caught him. He looked to where his left hand should be, then followed the path where his left arm should be, and eventually his eyes met his shoulder. Nothing. His left arm was gone, and Brian knew the nightmare was real. Brian laid back down in bed, in absolute shock of what had happened. He then got the last memory, seeing Brenner next to him. He asked the nurse where Brenner was. She told him he was just one room over. Brian attempted to get up and out of the bed, but the nurse insisted he lie back down and rest. Brian just kept saying,
I need to see him. I need to make sure he's okay.
The nurse quickly sedated Brian before he got too far out of the bed. Brian laid back down on the bed and went back to sleep. He woke up about 2 hours later, surrounded by two nurses, a doctor, and Rear Admiral Santiago.
Where's Brenner? Let me see him.
It's gonna be all right, Spartan. You two are safe. Son, you lost your left arm in the fight. We need to know if you would like a replacement for your arm.
If it'll get me out of here faster? Yeah. How long have I been out?
4 days. Listen. Brenner is in rough shape. He has yet to wake up. He's in a coma. You should be discharged soon, and we'll be able to visit him. See you soon, Spartan.
Another hour passed, with nurses and doctors coming in and out of Brian's hospital room, preparing for his discharge. The nurse who helped Brian before took him over to Brenner's room. Brian sat down at Brenner's bedside and the nurse left, closing the door behind her. Brian sat with Brenner for hours, going through every possible emotion, every possible situation, just thinking back on what happened. Brian finally got himself together and decided he was going to fight, hoping Brenner would wake up so they could talk again. Later that day, Brian would be outfitted with a new military-grade prosthetic arm. He would also be issued new armor. Brian didn't want a typical set of armor, though. To honor the fallen ODSTs, he would get a custom set of armor. Brian wears the Mjolnir version of the ODST helmet with the UACNM attachment, along with an ODST shoulder armor on his right side. He chose the security variant on his left shoulder for the extra protection to his prosthetic. He is equipped with an assault sapper torso piece, has FJ Par knee pads. I'm telling you, they're the best. He has a tactile UGPS to ensure he is always aware of his surroundings and is able to communicate on any battlefield. Since that day, he always, and I mean always, keeps some version of a trauma kit on him. I don't think I've ever seen him without one. Understandable, though. It would take Brian about 2 weeks to not only go through more recovery, but train himself best he could with his new prosthetic arm. Once he was back in the field, he would go on a few small missions to get himself back to normal. After each mission, he would visit Brenner in the hospital, hoping he was awake. But as time went on, hope faded more and more from Brian. During one of Brian's routine visits, nurse told him they would have to take Brenner off life support. Brian used what influence he had to make sure Brenner would stay on life support as long as possible. Brian wasn't going to give up on Brenner, even if it ended his career.